On August 21st, 30 BCE, a woman lies motionless in her chambers in the palace of Alexandria. Cleopatra VII, the last ruler of a dynasty stretching back 300 years, has just died. With her, something far greater is extinguished: 3,000 years of continuous Egyptian civilization. When Roman soldiers pass through the palace's golden gates, they are not just conquering a kingdom. They are closing the longest chapter in human history. But to understand this ending, we must travel back in time. Far back, to a place where it all began, where the desert meets the river, and where one man will unite two kingdoms to create the most enduring empire the world has ever known. 5,000 years before our era, the Nile Valley is a green corridor cutting through an endless ocean of sand. Communities live scattered about, cultivating wheat and barley on the fertile banks that the river floods each year. There are no pyramids, no monumental temples, only mud and reed villages, where people worship animal spirits and bury their dead in shallow pits. But something is changing. The villages are becoming towns. The towns are becoming cities. And the cities are beginning to compete for resources, for land, for power. Slowly, two emerging kingdoms are taking shape: Upper Egypt in the south, with its white crown, and Lower Egypt in the north, with its red crown. For centuries, these two lands remain separate, rivals, locked in sporadic wars that neither side can definitively win. The year is 3100 BCE. A warrior king from the south, named Narmer, marches north with his army. Later chronicles will also remember him as Menes, the unifier. In a series of brutal military campaigns, Narmer subdues the cities of the Delta. He conquers Memphis, and in a highly symbolic act, he unites the two crowns into one, the double crown of Egypt. He calls himself King of Upper and Lower Egypt, a title that will endure for 3 millennia. This moment marks the beginning of the dynastic period, the First Dynasty. For the first time, a single ruler controls the entire Nile Valley, from the southern cataracts to the Mediterranean Sea. Narmer establishes his capital in Memphis, strategically located on the border between the two former kingdoms. Here begins something unprecedented: a centralized state with a bureaucracy, a standing army, and an ideology that will transform the king into something more than human. Narmer's successors were not content with being mere earthly rulers. They developed a revolutionary concept. The pharaoh was not simply a king. He was a living god, the incarnation of Horus on earth, the mediator between the human and divine worlds. This idea justified their absolute power and transformed every political act into a sacred ritual. During the early dynastic period, encompassing the first two dynasties from 3010 to 206,186 BCE, the pharaohs consolidated their control. They created an elite of officials, scribes who recorded taxes, and priests who legitimized their divine authority. Royal tombs became more elaborate. They were no longer simple pits, but rectangular mud brick structures called mastabas, precursors to something far grander to come. The concept of the afterlife began to take shape. The Egyptians believed that the soul needed a preserved body and provisions for its journey to the hereafter. The year is 2667 BCE. Pharaoh Djoser, also known as Zoser, reigns during the Third Dynasty. He summons his vizier and chief architect, a man named Imhotep. The commission is clear yet audacious: to build a tomb that surpasses all previous tombs, a monument that will ensure the king's immortality. Imhotep conceives something revolutionary. Instead of building a traditional mastaba, he decides to stack 6 mastabas one on top of the other, each smaller than the one before it. The result is a stepped structure 60 meters high, the Pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara. It is the first monumental stone structure in human history. Until then, the Egyptians built with mud bricks. Imhotep not only invents the pyramid, he invents monumental stone architecture. The limestone blocks are cut, transported, and stacked with millimeter precision. Thousands of workers collaborate on a project that will take years. This pyramid is not just a tomb. It is a statement. The pharaohs can conquer death itself through monumentality. The Third and Fourth Dynasties, from 2686 to 2494 BCE, constitute the Old Kingdom, Egypt's first golden age. This is the era of the Great Pyramids, when pharaonic power reached its absolute zenith. Djoser's successors perfected the pyramid design. Pharaoh Sneferu, the first king of the 4th dynasty, built 3 pyramids, experimenting with angles and techniques. One of them, the bent pyramid of Dashur, shows a change in angle halfway up, evidence of the engineering challenges they faced. But these experiments paved the way for the impossible. The Egyptian state was at its organizational peak. An efficient bureaucracy collected taxes and grain, controlled the workforce, and coordinated monumental projects. It wasn't slaves who built the pyramids, but rotating teams of workers during the flood seasons, when the fields could not be cultivated. It is a system of communal work, a tax in the form of labor. The year is 2560 BCE. On the Giza Plateau, Pharaoh Khufu, son of Sneferu, begins construction of the most iconic monument in human history, the Great Pyramid. For 23 years, tens of thousands of workers cut, transported, and positioned 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons. Some granite blocks in the inner chambers weigh up to 80 tons. They had no pulleys, no wheels, no iron. Only fiber ropes, wooden sleds, mud and brick ramps, wooden levers, and a logistical organization that would not be seen again for millennia. The pyramid rises 146 meters into the sky, perfectly aligned with the cardinal points, with a margin of error of less than a fraction of a degree. For 3,800 years, it would be the tallest structure built by humans. Khufu's successors, Khafre and Menkaure, built their own pyramids at Giza, slightly smaller but equally impressive. Beside them, the Great Sphinx stands guard, a lion with a human face carved into the living rock, representing the pharaoh as the eternal guardian. But building for eternity comes at a cost. State resources are concentrated on these monumental projects. Centralized power in Memphis is absolute, but also fragile. The pharaohs of the 5th and 6th dynasties, from 2494 to 2181 BCE, begin to lose their iron grip. The nomarchs, provincial governors of the nomes or provinces, accumulate power and independence. They build their own elaborate tombs, challenging the royal monopoly on monumentality. The pyramids of this period are smaller, less ambitious, and built with inferior materials. Central authority weakens. Prolonged droughts affect the Nile's flooding, leading to famines. The system that sustained the Old Kingdom begins to crack. And then, around 2181 BCE, it all collapses. The first intermediate period is an age of fragmentation. The unified kingdom disintegrates into rival territories. Nomarchs become local kings, fighting amongst themselves for resources and land. Famines persist. Texts from this period describe chaos, brother fighting brother, tombs desecrated, and social orders inverted. The capital, Memphis, loses its authority. For more than 140 years, Egypt is divided, weak, and vulnerable. There are no grand construction projects, no military campaigns of conquest, only survival. But even in collapse, something persists. The memory of unity, the idea that Egypt must be one, ruled by a single, divine pharaoh. This memory will be the seed of restoration. The year is 2050 BCE. In the city of Thebes, in Upper Egypt, a family of ambitious nomarchs consolidates its power. They proclaim themselves pharaohs of a local 11th dynasty. For decades, they fight rival dynasties in the north and other regions. Finally, a ruler named Mentuhotep II emerges victorious. Through diplomacy and war, he reconquers Lower Egypt. Around 2000 BCE, Egypt is unified again under a single ruler. The Middle Kingdom begins, a second golden age. But Mentuhotep knows that unity is fragile. He must restore not only territory, but trust, prosperity, the very idea of Egypt. The challenge is monumental. Can this new pharaoh rebuild what 3 centuries of greatness could not sustain? The answer will determine whether Egypt will live another 1,000 years, or whether reunification is just a temporary mirage before the next collapse. Mentuhotep II was not content with military victory alone. He established his capital at Thebes, elevating the local god Ammonius to a prominent position in the Egyptian pantheon. He initiated construction projects to revitalize the economy and legitimize his dynasty. His tomb temple at Deir el-Bahari was an architectural innovation. Step terraces integrated into the cliff face, combining tomb and temple into a single complex. It differed from the pyramids of the Old Kingdom, reflecting a new era with new symbols. Mentuhotep restored the central administration, appointed loyal officials, and revived trade with neighboring regions. Egypt breathed again. Farmland was redistributed, irrigation systems were repaired, and trade routes were secured. Slowly, prosperity returned to the Nile Valley. The Middle Kingdom, encompassing the 11th and 12th dynasties from 2000 BCE to 1792 BCE, is not merely a political restoration. It is a cultural renaissance. Scribes compose literature that explores profound themes: the nature of power, social justice, and the meaning of life. Texts such as the Lamentations of Epure reflect on the chaos of the First Intermediate Period. The Tale of the Shipwrecked Sailor blends adventure and philosophy. The Teachings of Amenemhat offers advice on leadership. This is the classical age of Egyptian literature. The concepts of Ma'at, justice, and cosmic order are refined. The pharaoh is no longer just an unattainable god, but a responsible shepherd of his people, a guarantor of universal balance. The afterlife becomes partially democratized. The coffin texts adapted the ancient pyramid texts for use by nobles and officials, not just pharaohs. Immortality became more accessible, although it still required financial means for elaborate funerary preparations. The 12th dynasty, initiated by Amenemhat I around 1991 BCE, took Egypt to new heights. These pharaohs were brilliant administrators and pragmatic conquerors. Amenemhat moved the capital back north to a city called Ichtoi, near Memphis, seeking a more central position for efficient rule. His successor, Senusret I, launched military expeditions into Nubia to the south, securing trade routes to gold mines and diorite quarries. The pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom expanded Egypt's borders further than the Old Kingdom had achieved. Senusret III was particularly aggressive. He built a series of massive fortresses in Nubia, mud brick structures with 10-meter-high walls, garrisoned by professional soldiers. These fortresses controlled trade and projected Egyptian power deep into African territory. To the north, they established trade and diplomatic relations with the city-states of Syria and Palestine. Amenemhat III undertook one of the most ambitious engineering projects of antiquity. The Fayum Oasis, connected to the Nile by a natural channel, held untapped agricultural potential. Amenemhat ordered the construction of a massive system of dikes, canals, and regulators to control the flooding of Lake Moeris, transforming thousands of hectares of marshland into fertile farmland. The result dramatically increased Egypt's agricultural production, generating surpluses that enriched the royal treasury and enabled even more ambitious projects. Amenemhat built an administrative complex near the Fayum, described by later historians as the Labyrinth, a palace temple with countless corridors and chambers. Although now in ruins, Greek writers who visited it 1,500 years later considered it a marvel comparable to the pyramids. But even this second golden age has hidden weaknesses. The 12th dynasty ends around 1792 BCE. The 13th dynasty that follows is a confusing succession of short-lived pharaohs, many ruling for only years or even months. Stability evaporates. The reasons are not entirely clear. Perhaps internal power struggles. Perhaps a succession crisis with no clear heirs. Perhaps the bureaucratic system becomes too cumbersome, too rigid. As central authority weakens, an external threat grows on the delta's borders. Groups of Asian migrants have been arriving in Egypt for generations, drawn by its prosperity. They settle in the eastern delta, in cities like Avaris. Gradually, these foreigners accumulate power, influence, and territory. Around 1650 BCE, something unthinkable happened. The Asian rulers in Avaris declared themselves pharaohs. The Egyptians called them Hyksos, rulers of foreign lands. They controlled Lower Egypt while weak native dynasties precariously maintained Upper Egypt. The Second Intermediate Period began. The Hyksos were not simply barbarian invaders. They adopted Egyptian titles and customs, wrote their names in hieroglyphs, and worshipped Seth and other Egyptian deities alongside their own gods. But they also brought military innovations: the horse-drawn war chariot, more powerful composite bows, and bronze scale armor, technologies the Egyptians did not possess. Hyksos rule lasted for more than a century. For the Egyptians, it was a national humiliation. Later texts describe them as cruel tyrants, although archaeological evidence suggests a more complex relationship with continued cultural exchange and trade. But the narrative of victimization becomes powerful, galvanizing a resistance movement in the south. In Thebes, the 17th dynasty of Egypt plots reconquest. Pharaoh Seqenenre II initiates the rebellion. His mummy displays severe traumatic injuries to the skull, evidence that he died in battle, possibly fighting the Hyksos. His son, Kamose, continues the war. The stelae he erects describe his campaigns in triumphal language, attacking Hyksos positions and disrupting their alliances with Nubia. But it is Kamose's brother, Ahmose I, who finally drives out the Hyksos. Around 1550 BCE, Ahmose besieges Avaris. After years of fighting, the city falls. The Hyksos are driven back into Canaan. Ahmose pursues the remnants, besieging cities in Palestine to ensure the threat does not return. Egypt is unified once more. But Ahmose did not stop at reunification. He learned from the Hyksos invasion that passive defense was insufficient. Egypt had to control territories beyond its traditional borders, create buffer zones, and project power. Ahmose adopted Hyksos military technologies, horses, chariots, and improved bronze weapons. He reformed the army, creating a permanent professional corps of soldiers and chariots. He launched campaigns in Nubia, reconquering territories lost during the Second Intermediate Period. He established a viceroyalty in Nubia, with an Egyptian administrator directly controlling local resources. Ahmose founded the 18th dynasty around 1550 BCE, marking the beginning of the New Kingdom. This would be Egypt's third and most glorious golden age. But it would also be something new. Egypt would no longer be just a kingdom, but a conquering military empire, projecting its power from Nubia to the Euphrates. Ahmose's successors consolidated the empire. Thutmose I expanded Egypt's borders to the fourth cataract of the Nile in Nubia and launched expeditions as far as the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia. But when Thutmose II died, his heir, Thutmose III, was just a child. The pharaoh's widow, Hatshepsut, assumed the regency. And then, around 1479 BCE, she did something extraordinary. She declared herself pharaoh. She did not reign merely as regent or queen mother. She was depicted in statues wearing a pharaonic false beard, a male royal kilt, and all the symbols of absolute power. She is one of the few documented cases of a woman ruling as pharaoh in 3,000 years of Egyptian history. Hatshepsut was not a warrior. Her 22-year reign was characterized by prosperity, monumental construction, and commercial expeditions. The most famous is the expedition to the legendary Punt, a mysterious land on the East African coast, probably Somalia or Yemen. Reliefs in its mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari depict Egyptian ships returning laden with myrrh trees, frankincense, ebony, ivory, and gold. When Hatshepsut died around 1458 BCE, Thutmose III finally ruled alone. He then became the greatest conqueror in Egyptian history. For 33 years, he launched 17 military campaigns into Syria-Palestine. His first campaign is legendary. At the Battle of Megiddo, around 1457 BCE, he faced a coalition of rebellious Canaanite city-states. Thutmose chose a perilous route through a narrow pass that his generals considered suicidal. But his audacity surprised the enemy. The Egyptians emerged from the pass, deployed their chariots, and routed the coalition. Megiddo was besieged for 7 months before surrendering. Thutmose did not stop there. He crossed the Euphrates, erected a stele on the east bank, marking the maximum extent of the Egyptian empire. It controls territories from Nubia to Syria, extracting massive tributes in gold, silver, cedar wood, horses, and slaves. Egypt has never been richer, more powerful, or more feared. But empire, as its successors will discover, is easier to conquer than to maintain. The year is 1400 BCE. The Temple of Karnak at Thebes is a constantly expanding monumental complex. The cult of Ammonius-Ra, king of the gods, dominates Egyptian religious life. The priests of Ammonius control vast lands, treasures, and manpower. They are as powerful as the pharaoh himself. Every military conquest, every foreign tribute, enriches the temple. The pharaohs of the 18th dynasty depend on the priests to legitimize their rule, but this dependence becomes a vulnerability. Religious power threatens to eclipse royal power. The pharaohs Amenhotep II and Thutmose IV maintain a balance, but it is precarious. Amenhotep III, who reigns from 1391 to 1353 BCE, is the last of the great traditional pharaohs. His 38-year reign is one of unparalleled luxury. He builds the Temple of Luxor, palace after palace, and colossal statues. He marries Tai, a woman of non-royal birth, breaking with the tradition of marriages exclusively within the royal family. Egypt is at the height of its wealth and power. But beneath the golden surface, tensions are rising. The priests of Ammonius are too powerful. Amenhotep III's son will inherit not only an empire, but also an unresolved problem. Who truly controls Egypt, the pharaoh or the gods? Amenhotep IV ascended the throne around 1353 BCE. From the very beginning, he was different. Artistic depictions show him with unusual features: an elongated skull, a narrow face, wide hips, and a prominent belly. Some historians speculate about medical conditions. Others suggest it was simply a new artistic style. But his physical appearance is the least controversial aspect. Amenhotep IV was obsessed with Aten, the solar disk, a minor deity associated with the physical aspect of the sun. During the early years of his reign, he began to promote Aten above other gods, including Ammonius. He built temples to Aten at Karnak, in the heart of Ammonius territory. The priests watched with growing alarm. And then, in the 5th year of his reign, Amenhotep IV did the unthinkable. The pharaoh changed his name to Akhenaten, he who serves Aten. He declared that Aten was the only true god. Not merely the chief god, but the only one. All other gods were false. This was an unprecedented theological revolution. Polytheism had defined Egypt for millennia. Akhenaten didn't stop at declarations. He abandoned Thebes completely. He founded a new capital in the middle of the desert, 300 kilometers to the north. He called it Akhetaten, the horizon of Aten. Today it is known as Amarna. In just 4 years, an entire city rose from the sand. Palaces, temples, and housing for thousands of officials, artisans, and priests. The temples to Aten were different. They had no roofs, open to the sky to receive direct sunlight. There were no statues hidden in dark sanctuaries. Only altars where the solar disk shone. Akhenaten was depicted with his wife Nefertiti and their daughters worshipping Aten, whose rays ended in small hands that bestowed life. But Akhenaten goes further. He orders the closure of temples to other gods throughout Egypt. Thousands of priests lose their positions, their income, their purpose. Daily offerings to the deities cease. Traditional religious festivals are canceled. Teams of workers are ordered to enter ancient temples and chisel the names of the gods, especially Ammonius, from the inscriptions. They erase Egypt's most powerful god from history itself. The resources that flowed to Karnak now flow to Akhetaten. The economic impact is devastating. Provinces that relied on the temples for administration, employment, and food redistribution suffer. But Akhenaten is obsessed with his vision. He composes poetic hymns to Aten, celebrating the solar disk as the universal creator, the source of life, the loving father of all creation. The great hymn to Aten displays theological sophistication, anticipating monotheistic concepts that will not reappear in the region for centuries. While Akhenaten builds his religious utopia, the empire crumbles. The Amarna letters, cuneiform tablets discovered in the royal archives, reveal an external crisis. Vassal princes in Syria and Palestine send desperate pleas. The Hittites, a growing empire in Anatolia, press from the north. The Habaru, nomadic groups, attack Egyptian cities. Local rulers plead for troops, reinforcements, pharaonic intervention. The letters receive delayed replies, or no reply at all. Akhenaten is not interested in wars of conquest. His attention is completely absorbed by the religious revolution. Territories conquered by Thutmose III are lost. Egyptian prestige declines. Allies doubt their commitment. The diplomatic network built over a century unravels. Nefertiti, Akhenaten's wife, is an enigmatic figure. Her bust, discovered in a sculptor's workshop at Amarna, is one of the most recognizable works of art from the ancient world. Symmetrical face, elegant neck, tall blue crown. But beyond her beauty, her political role is uncertain. She appears constantly in reliefs alongside Akhenaten, participating in religious rituals, even performing acts traditionally reserved for the pharaoh, striking captive enemies, making offerings alone. Some researchers suggest she ruled as co-regent. Around the 12th year of Akhenaten's reign, Nefertiti disappears from the records. Did she die? Did she fall from grace? Did she adopt a different name and briefly rule as pharaoh after Akhenaten? The evidence is fragmentary, contradictory, and frustrating. What is clear is that Akhenaten ruled for approximately 17 years. And when he died around 1336 BC, his religious experiment died with him. A 9-year-old boy named Tutankhaten ascends the throne. He is probably the son of Akhenaten, although the exact relationship is debated. He is a pawn in the hands of senior officials, the vizier I and the general Hormheb. These men understand that Akhenaten's revolution has been a disaster. Egypt needs stability, reconciliation, a return to tradition. During the first 3 years of the boy pharaoh's reign, the court abandons Akhenaten. They return to Thebes. The boy changes his name to Tutankhamen, living image of Ammonius. It is a public declaration. Ammonius is restored. The ancient temples are reopened. The priests regain their positions. Repairs begin on the vandalized inscriptions. Stele proclaimed that the young pharaoh has restored Ma'at, the cosmic order, which his father had disrupted. Tutankhamen is presented as the healer, restorer, and savior of Egypt. But Tutankhamen is a figurehead. The real decisions are made by I and Hormheb. The young pharaoh sponsors building projects, appears at ceremonies, and marries Enkhesenamen, probably his half-sister, the daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. They try to produce heirs. 2 babies are born prematurely, both die. Their tiny mummies will be found millennia later in his tomb. Tutankhamen never reaches maturity. He dies around 1327 BCE, at about 18 or 19 years old. The exact cause is uncertain. Malaria, complications from a broken leg, infection, perhaps a combination. His death is sudden. There is no royal tomb prepared. A private tomb in the Valley of the Kings is hastily adapted. His burial is comparatively modest for a pharaoh, but still rich beyond imagination. Gilded statues, chariots, weapons, jewelry, more than 5,000 objects crammed into small chambers. For 3,200 years, Tutankhamun's tomb remained undisturbed, forgotten. The Valley of the Kings was repeatedly looted over millennia. Almost every royal tomb was desecrated, stripped of treasure. But the entrance to Tutankhamun's tomb was buried under rubble when the tomb of Ramses VI, directly above it, was excavated. Centuries of debris completely obscured it. Tutankhamun himself was erased from the official royal lists. Later pharaohs did not want to remember the Amarna period. Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and their immediate successors were treated as illegitimate, aberrations best forgotten. Then, on November 4, 1922, the British archaeologist Howard Carter discovered a buried staircase in the valley. He descended into a sealed passageway. And on November 26, with a flickering candle shining through a hole in the sealed door, Carter sees wonderful things, the only substantially intact royal burial ever discovered in Egypt. But let's return to 1327 BCE. After Tutankhamun's death, the elderly I reigns briefly for only 4 years. Then Hormheb, the general, takes the throne. He rules for 28 years, from 1323 to 1295 BCE. Hormheb has no royal blood. He is a career military officer. But he has the army, and that is enough. Hormheb completes the restoration. And he goes further. He initiates the damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. He orders the systematic destruction of Akhenaten. The buildings are dismantled, the blocks reused in other projects. The names of Akhenaten and Tutankhamun are removed from the royal lists. In official documents, the reign jumps directly from Amenhotep III to Hormheb, as if the intervening years had never existed. Akhenaten is completely abandoned, becoming a ghost town swallowed by the sand. Akhenaten's monotheistic experiment was buried, forgotten for 3,000 years until modern archaeologists unearthed it. Hormheb had no heir. He named a fellow military officer, Ramses I, as his successor. And with this act, he began the 19th dynasty, which would lead Egypt to its last age of true imperial grandeur under the most famous pharaoh of all. Ramses I ruled for only 2 years. His son, Seti I, ascended the throne around 1294 BCE. Seti was a brilliant military leader, determined to fully restore the Egyptian empire to its former glory. He launched campaigns in Palestine and Syria, confronting not only rebellious city-states, but also a rival superpower, the Hittite Empire. The Hittites controlled Anatolia and much of Syria. For a century, they had been expanding their influence southward, inevitably clashing with Egyptian interests. Seti recaptured territories, secured strongholds, and re-established Egyptian authority in Canaan. But he could not completely subdue the Hittites. The campaigns were successful, but inconclusive. The conflict reached a strategic stalemate. Seti also invested heavily in construction. He began the Great Hypostyle Hall at Karnak, a forest of 134 massive columns, some 23 meters tall. His tomb in the Valley of the Kings is the longest and deepest excavated up to that time, decorated with reliefs and paintings of extraordinary beauty. Around 1279 BCE, Seti's son, Ramses II, became pharaoh. He would rule for 66 years, one of the longest reigns in Egyptian history. Ramses lived to be 90, an extraordinary longevity for the time. He had over 100 children by 8 principal wives and numerous concubines. He built more monuments than any other pharaoh. His name was everywhere, even on monuments he didn't build, usurping inscriptions of his predecessors. Ramses II became the personification of pharaonic power, the model of the great king. His image would be remembered for millennia. The Greeks would know him as Ozymandias. But his legacy begins with a battle that nearly ended in disaster. The year is 1274 BCE, the 5th year of Ramses' reign. The pharaoh marches north with an army divided into 4 divisions named after gods: Ammonius, Ra, Ta, and Seth. Their objective is Kadesh, a strategic city in Syria controlled by the Hittite king Muwatalli II. Ramses leads the Ammonius division, advancing confidently. 2 Bedouins desert from the Hittite side, informing Ramses that the Hittites are far away, afraid to face the powerful Egyptian army. Ramses believes the information. He establishes camp near Kadesh with only the Ammonius division, expecting the other divisions to catch up. It is a trap. The Bedouins are Hittite spies. The entire Hittite army, with thousands of chariots, is hidden behind Kadesh. They attack the Ra division as it marches toward the camp, scattering it in panic. Then they descend upon Ramses' camp. Chaos erupts. Hittite chariots roll through the Egyptian defenses. Soldiers flee. Ramses is surrounded, his personal guard desperately holding back waves of attackers. Later reliefs in Egyptian temples dramatically depict this moment. Ramses, alone in his chariot, invoking Ammonius, fighting like a lion against countless enemies. The reality was probably less heroic and more chaotic. But Ramses does not die. Ta's division arrives just in time, attacking the Hittite flank. Simultaneously, an elite Egyptian force from the Canaanite coast unexpectedly appears, attacking from another direction. The Hittites, laden with plunder from the looted Egyptian camp, scatter in disarray. The battle becomes a bloody stalemate. Both sides suffer massive losses. The next day, the armies clash again, but neither can gain a decisive advantage. Finally, they agree to a tacit ceasefire. Ramses withdraws his army south. Kadesh remains in Hittite hands. But when Ramses returns to Egypt, he declares victory. Temples are covered with epic reliefs depicting his personal triumph at Kadesh. An epic poem, the Poem of Pentuer, is commissioned, narrating his superhuman bravery. Kadesh becomes the centerpiece of his propaganda. To the Egyptians, Ramses saved the army through divine courage. The more complex truth, that he narrowly averted catastrophe due to flawed intelligence, is omitted. For the next 16 years, Ramses launches intermittent campaigns against the Hittites. Neither achieves a decisive victory. The conflict exhausts both empires. Storm clouds gather on the strategic horizon. Assyria is growing in the east. The Sea Peoples, mysterious coalitions of invaders, begin to destabilize the eastern Mediterranean. Egypt and Hutti realized that continued warfare weakens them against greater threats. In 1258 BCE, Ramses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III signed a peace treaty, one of the oldest surviving diplomatic documents. Copies in Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform preserve its terms: perpetual peace, a mutual defensive alliance, extradition of fugitives, and pardon for repatriated individuals. It was an agreement between equals, with each recognizing their respective spheres of influence. 13 years later, in 1245 BCE, Ramses sealed the alliance by marrying a Hittite princess. She was received in Egypt with magnificent ceremonies and given an Egyptian name, Mather-Neferer. The dynastic marriage symbolized the transformation of mortal enemies into allies. Peace between Egypt and Hutti lasted for the remainder of Ramses' reign. Both empires prospered. Trade flourished. Stability allowed for massive monumental projects. Ramses built tirelessly. He completed the great hypostyle hall at Karnak, begun by his father. He constructed his mortuary temple, the Ramesseum, on the west bank of Thebes, with a seated statue of himself that originally weighed 1,000 tons. He built a new capital in the eastern delta called Pi-Ramses, House of Ramses, with palaces, temples, military barracks, and arsenals. But his most iconic project was in Nubia. At Abu Simbel, Ramses ordered 2 temples to be carved directly into a sandstone cliff. The larger temple was flanked by 4 colossal seated statues of Ramses, each 20 meters high. Twice a year, on dates aligned with his birthday and coronation, sunlight penetrated 60 meters into the temple, illuminating the statues of the gods in the inner sanctuary. It was a masterpiece of astronomical engineering and a declaration of power. The message is clear. Ramses is not simply pharaoh. He is divine, eternal, unbreakable. Ramses lived so long that many of his children predeceased him. His initially designated heir, Amenerhotep, died. His second son, Ramses, also died. Finally, his 13th son, Marinta, about 60 years old, inherited the throne around 1213 BC. Marinta immediately faced crises that Ramses did not have to fully confront. The Sea Peoples were on the move. Coalitions of invaders attacked the eastern Mediterranean. The Mycenaean Greeks collapsed, the Hittite Empire disintegrated, and cities along the coast were destroyed. Groups of these invaders, allied with Libyan tribes, attacked the western delta of Egypt. Marinta defeated them in a major battle around 1208 BCE, killing thousands and capturing thousands more. It was a significant victory, but it only delayed the inevitable. The late Bronze Age world was collapsing. Among Marinta's triumphs is a stele erected around 1208 BCE. It lists the defeated enemies, Libyans, Hittites, Canaanites. And it mentions a name that appears for the first time in historical records, Israel. Israel is laid waste. Its seed is no more. This is the first extra-biblical evidence of Israel as an entity in Canaan. The context suggests a tribal group or people, not yet an established kingdom. This brief mention is enormously significant for biblical and historical studies, confirming the Israelite presence in Canaan by the end of the 13th century BCE. But for the Egyptians, it is simply another line on a list of victories. They cannot imagine that this obscure people will one day produce texts that will influence Western civilization more profoundly than all Egyptian hieroglyphs combined. Marinta died around 1203 BCE after ruling for approximately 10 years. His death triggered a succession crisis. The 19th dynasty disintegrated in internal strife. Several pretenders claimed the throne. A man named Amenmès briefly ruled in the south, while Seti II ruled in the north. Centralized control fragmented. The situation stabilized somewhat when Siptah, a young man possibly with a physical disability, assumed the throne, manipulated by the widowed Queen Tasret. When Siptah died, Tasret ruled as pharaoh in her own right for a few years, the second woman confirmed to do so after Hatshepsut. But around 1190 BCE, an official named Setnacht overthrew Tasret, founding the 20th dynasty. His son, Ramses III, would face the ultimate test, the full force of the Sea Peoples. This time, it would not be a mere incursion. It will be a mass migration of displaced peoples desperately seeking new lands. And Egypt is directly in their path. The year is 1182 BCE. The eastern Mediterranean is in chaos. The Hittite Empire, which for centuries rivaled Egypt, has completely collapsed. Its capital, Hattusa, lies in ruins, abandoned and burned. The Mycenaean civilization in Greece is disintegrating. Palaces like Mycenae and Pylos are destroyed. International trade, which for centuries connected Mesopotamia to Egypt, is disrupted. Coastal cities in Syria, Canaan, and Cyprus are looted and burned. Hittite and Ugaritic records speak of famines, maritime attacks, and desperate cities pleading for help that never comes. The Sea Peoples are not a single nation. They are a coalition of displaced ethnic groups: Peleset, Sheker, Shikalesh, Denyen, and Weshish. Some likely come from the Aegean, others from Anatolia, and still others from regions yet unknown. They move by land and sea, carrying families and possessions, searching for new territories. And now they look towards the last great stable kingdom, Egypt. Ramses III was not a natural military leader like his namesake Ramses II, but he was determined to defend Egypt. He restructured the army, recruiting foreign mercenaries, Libyans, Nubians, peoples from the Middle East, to supplement the native forces. He fortified the borders, and he waited. In his 8th year of reign, around 1177 BCE, the storm arrived. The Sea Peoples invaded on two fronts. By land, they advanced through Canaan toward the Egyptian delta. By sea, a massive fleet sailed toward the delta's coast. It was the greatest existential threat Egypt had faced in centuries. Ramses responded with a deep defensive strategy. On land, he met the invaders on the northeastern border, in the region the Egyptians called Jahi. The battle was fierce, chaotic, and brutal. Reliefs in Ramses' mortuary temple at Medinet Habu depict Egyptians fighting enemy chariots, archers firing volleys of arrows, and prisoners being executed. But the decisive battle takes place at sea, near the mouths of the Nile. The Sea Peoples have numbers, but Ramses has preparation. Egyptian ships, strategically positioned in canals and river mouths, ambush the invading fleet. Archers on the banks unleash volleys of arrows at the enemy's ships. Egyptian ships, more maneuverable in shallow water, board and sink enemy vessels. It is a massacre. The Sea Peoples are crushed. Reliefs from Medinet Habu depict enemies drowning, capsized ships, and prisoners being led in chains before the pharaoh. Ramses captures thousands, incorporating some as mercenaries and settlers in border regions. One group, the Peleset, will be settled on the southern coast of Canaan. They are probably the Philistines mentioned in later biblical texts. Ramses III has saved Egypt. It is the last great military victory in pharaonic history. But the cost is immense. The war drains the Egyptian treasury. International trade, on which Egypt depended for raw materials such as timber, copper, and tin, is disrupted. The networks that sustained the late Bronze Age economy have collapsed. Egypt survives, but it is isolated and economically weakened. Ramses faces internal challenges. Around his 29th year, workers at the royal necropolis in Deir el-Medina, who construct tombs in the Valley of the Kings, staged the first documented labor strike in history. They have not received their grain rations for weeks. They sit in front of the mortuary temple of Thutmose III and refuse to work until they are paid. "We are hungry," they declare. The administration, unable to provide rations, shows deep dysfunction. Inflation soars. The redistributive system that functioned for centuries breaks down. The reign of Ramses III ended in tragedy. In his 32nd year, a conspiracy emerged within the royal harem. Tai, a minor wife, wanted her son Pentor to become pharaoh instead of the designated heir. She conspired with palace officials, harem administrators, and even a military general. The plan, to assassinate the pharaoh. Records of the subsequent trial reveal that they used magic, creating wax figurines to curse the pharaoh and his guards. The conspiracy was carried out. Ramses was attacked, likely his throat slashed. The medical papyrus accompanying his mummy shows evidence of a deep neck wound. Ramses died, but the conspiracy failed. The rightful heir, who would become Ramses IV, assumed power. The conspirators were arrested and tried. Some were executed, others forced to commit suicide. Pentor was forced to take poison. His mummy, discovered millennia later, displays contorted features, preserved in a grimace of agony. The successors of Ramses III, Ramses IV through Ramses XI, are weak figures presiding over an unstoppable decline. The 20th dynasty, from approximately 1188 to 1170 BCE, is an era of progressive fragmentation. The pharaohs nominally control Egypt, but their authority is increasingly fictitious. In Thebes, the high priests of Ammonius accumulate independent power. They control vast lands, private armies, and their own treasuries. They are effectively kings in all but name. In the Delta, the Libyan families who settled in Egypt as mercenaries and colonists form powerful communities. Their chieftains become local warlords. Southern and northern Egypt function almost as separate states. The economy steadily deteriorates. Wages are paid irregularly. Inflation renders grain and copper almost worthless as currency. The crisis reaches a horrific nadir. Tomb robbing becomes endemic. The treasures buried with the ancient pharaohs in the Valley of the Kings are too tempting. Organized gangs plunder royal tombs, melting down the gold and selling the artifacts. Even officials of the necropolis participate. Court records document the interrogations of captured thieves. They confess to entering tombs, destroying sarcophagi, and burning mummies to access the gold amulets wrapped in bandages. It is unthinkable sacrilege, but economic desperation erodes all norms. The priests responsible for the necropolis attempt to protect what remains. They move royal mummies from their desecrated tombs, consolidating them in secret caches. One hidden chamber in Deir el-Bahari eventually contains more than 50 royal mummies, including Ramses II, Seti I, and Thutmose III. There they will remain hidden for almost 3,000 years until their discovery in 1881. The priests write notes on the mummy wrappings, recording every move, every attempt to preserve what the crisis threatens to destroy. It is a desperate effort to protect the dignity of the ancestors as the world crumbles around them. Around 1070 BCE, the 20th dynasty ended. The third intermediate period began, lasting more than 300 years. Egypt fragmented into multiple centers of power. In Tanis, in the Delta, a dynasty of kings of Libyan origin, the 21st dynasty, ruled the north. They fully adopted Egyptian culture, pharaonic titles, and religion, but their power base was ethnically and regionally limited. In Thebes, the high priests of Ammonius ruled the south as priest-kings. They nominally recognized the authority of the pharaohs of Tanis, but operated independently. It was a period of bewildering political complexity, with multiple simultaneous dynasties, semi-independent local rulers, and shifting alliances. Dynastic marriages attempted to maintain the illusion of unity, but Egypt was divided in practice. Around 945 BCE, a Libyan military leader named Sheshonq I took the throne, founding the 22nd dynasty. Sheshonq was ambitious. He attempted to restore Egyptian power. He launched a military campaign in Palestine around 926 BCE, sacking cities in the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. This campaign is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, where Sheshonq is called Shishak, who sacked Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. This is one of the few direct correspondences between Egyptian and biblical records. But this campaign proved to be a final flourish. Sheshonq's successors were unable to maintain unity. Multiple dynastic lines vied for power. The 23rd dynasty ruled simultaneously from Leontopolis. Local dynasties emerged in cities of the Nile Delta. By the middle of the 8th century BCE, Egypt was divided into more than a dozen small kingdoms, each ruled by a local chieftain who appointed himself king. While the north fragments, something unexpected is happening in the south. The kingdom of Kush in Nubia, which had been conquered and dominated by Egypt for centuries, has developed its own Egyptianized civilization. The Kushites worship the Egyptian gods, especially Ammonius. They write in hieroglyphs. They build pyramids, though smaller and with steeper angles than the Egyptian ones. Their kings see themselves as restorers of true Egyptian civilization, corrupted in the north by foreign kings and division. Around 744 BCE, the Kushite king Pi marches north with his army. He comes not as a foreign invader, but as a liberator, restoring Ma'at, the cosmic order. In a brilliant campaign, Pi subdues the many kings of the Delta one by one. His victories steal one of the most detailed military narratives of ancient Egypt, describes how the northern princes prostrate themselves before him. Pi returned to Nubia, but his brother Shabaka completed the permanent conquest around 718 BCE, establishing the 25th dynasty, the Kushite dynasty. For the first time in history, black African pharaohs ruled all of Egypt. And strangely, these foreign conquerors were the most traditionalist of all, reviving art, architecture, and religious practices from the Old and Middle Kingdoms. While the Kushite pharaohs attempt to restore Egypt's glory, a new and brutal superpower rises in Mesopotamia, Assyria. The Assyrian kings have built the most efficient military machine of the ancient world. Professional standing armies, chariots, archers, heavy infantry, advanced siege technology with battering rams and mobile siege towers, and a policy of systematic terror. Rebellious cities are razed, entire populations deported, leaders impaled as a warning. The Assyrians have conquered Babylon, Syria, and Palestine. Now they set their sights on the ultimate prize, Egypt, the richest land in the known world. The Kushite pharaoh Taharqa, who rules from 690 to 664 BCE, is a capable ruler. He tries to strengthen Egypt, launching building campaigns, restoring temples, and reinforcing its defenses. But when the Assyrian king Esarhaddon invades around 671 BCE, the first incursion is repelled. Taharqa celebrates victory. It's premature. 667 BCE. Esarhaddon invades again, this time with a massive army. He advances swiftly across the Sinai to the Delta. The Egyptian forces are unable to stop him. Memphis, the ancient capital, is besieged. After only 15 days, the defenses collapse. The Assyrians take the city, plunder its treasures, and capture Taharqa's royal harem, including his wife and children. It is the first time in over 1,500 years that a foreign power has conquered Memphis. Taharqa flees south to Thebes. Esarhaddon is unable to consolidate the conquest. He dies during the campaign. But his successor, Ashurbanipal, is equally determined. Taharqa attempts to reconquer the north and briefly retakes Memphis. But Ashurbanipal responds with fury. 663 BCE, the Assyrians invade again. This time, they advance further than ever before. 663 BCE, the Assyrian armies march toward Upper Egypt. Taharqa has died, replaced by his nephew Tanadamani. The young pharaoh tries to resist, but it is futile. The Assyrians reach Thebes, the sacred city, religious capital of Egypt for 1,500 years, home to the most magnificent temples in the world. And they sack it. Assyrian soldiers desecrate the temples, topple statues, and steal tons of gold and silver, including 2 massive obelisks, which they carry as trophies back to Nineveh. They burn sections of the city. They deport thousands of inhabitants as slaves. The Hebrew prophet Nahum, writing decades later, will use the destruction of Thebes as a warning of what awaits Nineveh. Are you better than Noumenias, Thebes, which was situated by the Nile? Yet it was taken into exile. It is the ultimate humiliation, the spiritual heart of Egypt, violated by foreign invaders. But the Assyrians cannot rule Egypt directly. It is too far away, too large, and too culturally different. They establish a system of native Egyptian vassal kings in the Delta. One of these vassals is Psammetichus, ruler of the city of Sais. Psammetichus is cunning. He feigns loyalty to Assyria while secretly consolidating power. He recruits Greek and Carian mercenaries to form an army loyal only to him. When Assyria is distracted by rebellions in Babylon and threats from Median tribes, Psammetichus acts. Around 656 BCE, he declares himself independent, unifies the Delta under his control, and then marches south. The weakened Kushites cannot resist. They retreat to Nubia, where they will continue to rule their own kingdom for almost another 1,000 years. Psammetichus becomes the sole ruler of Egypt, founding the 26th dynasty, the Sate period. The Sate pharaohs presided over a remarkable renaissance. Psammetichus I and his successors deliberately revived artistic styles, religious texts, and administrative practices from the Old and Middle Kingdoms, 2,000 years in the past. It was a declaration: Egypt was ancient, eternal, and superior to its conquerors. Sate art was technically brilliant, consciously imitating classical models. Ancient texts were copied, temples were restored, and abandoned rituals were revived. Economically, Egypt opened itself to the Mediterranean world. Greek mercenaries and merchants settled in cities of the Delta, especially Naucratis, a trading port where Greeks could live under their own laws. Egypt exported grain, papyrus, and linen. It imported silver, timber, and wine. It was cosmopolitan and prosperous, but also aware that its independence depended on the regional balance of power. The Sate pharaohs carefully navigated between superpowers, Assyria to the east, then Babylon, then Persia. Necho II, who reigned from 610 to 595 BCE, was the most ambitious pharaoh of the dynasty. He attempted to project Egyptian power into Asia. He marched into Syria to support a dying Assyria against a rising Babylon. At the Battle of Megiddo in 609 BCE, he defeated King Josiah of Judah, who tried to blockade him. But at Carchemish in 605 BCE, the Egyptian army was crushed by the Babylonian prince Nebuchadnezzar. Egyptian imperial dreams died there. Necho also sponsored an extraordinary expedition. He sent Phoenician sailors to circumnavigate Africa. According to Herodotus, they set out from the Red Sea, sailed south along the east coast of Africa, rounded the Cape, went up the west coast, passed through the Strait of Gibraltar, and returned via the Mediterranean after 3 years. If true, it is one of the most amazing nautical feats of antiquity, not repeated until the Portuguese 2,100 years later. 525 years before our era, Cyrus the Great has built the Persian Empire, conquering Media, Lydia, and Babylon. His son, Cambyses II, looks toward Egypt. Pharaoh Psammetichus III, barely 6 months on the throne, faces the invasion. At the Battle of Pelusium, on the eastern border of the Delta, the armies clash. According to Herodotus, the Persians use a brutal psychological tactic. They place sacred Egyptian animals, cats, ibises, dogs, at the front of their lines, knowing that the religious Egyptians would hesitate to harm them. Whether these tactics are true or not, the Persians win decisively. Cambyses marches toward Memphis. The city resists briefly, then falls. Psammetichus is captured, initially pardoned, then executed when he attempts to rebel. Egypt becomes a Persian satrapy, a province of the largest empire the world has ever known. The Persians ruled Egypt for over a century, with one brief interruption. Cambyses desecrated temples, killed the sacred Apis bull, and is remembered by Egyptians as a blasphemous tyrant. Darius I, his successor, was more conciliatory. He completed a canal connecting the Nile to the Red Sea, facilitating trade. He codified Egyptian laws and respected religious traditions. But Egypt remained subservient, paying heavy tributes. The Persians extracted enormous resources for their wars against Greece. When the Greeks defeated the Persians at Marathon and Salamis, Egypt rebelled. Around 460 BCE, a Libyan prince named Inaros led a successful rebellion, temporarily expelling the Persians with Athenian help. For 60 years, native dynasties, the 28th, 9th, and 30th, ruled in independent Egypt once more. The last of these pharaohs, Nectanebo II, built extensively, adding structures to temples throughout Egypt. But in 343 BCE, the Persian king Artaxerxes III invaded with a massive army. Nectanebo resisted bravely, but he was outnumbered and outgunned. The Delta's defenses collapsed. Nectanebo fled south, then disappeared from the records, possibly escaping to Nubia. He was the last native pharaoh to rule Egypt. The Persians imposed a harsher grip this time. Artaxerxes plundered temples, deported priests, and extracted crushing tributes. Egyptians remember this period as especially oppressive. Persian rule lasted only another decade, but it seemed endless to Egyptians who dreamed of liberation. Then, a different storm arose from the west. A young Macedonian king had conquered Persia, and now he marched toward Egypt, not as an enemy conqueror, but as a liberator. 332 BCE, Alexander the Great, having defeated the Persian king Darius III at the battles of the Granicus and Issus, marches toward Egypt. The Persian satrap, without military support, simply surrenders the country. The Egyptians receive Alexander with jubilation. He is the liberator from the Persian yoke. But Alexander is cunning. He does not present himself as a foreign conqueror. He proclaims himself pharaoh, adopts full Egyptian titles, and sacrifices to the Egyptian gods. He travels to the Siwa oasis in the western desert to consult the oracle of Ammonius. The oracle declares him the son of Ammonius, divinely legitimizing him as pharaoh. Alexander founds a city on the Mediterranean coast, Alexandria, which will become one of the most important cities of the ancient world. But after only 6 months in Egypt, Alexander sets off to conquer the rest of the Persian Empire. He will never return alive. He dies in Babylon, 323 BCE, at the age of 32. His body was transported to Alexandria, where it was buried in a monumental tomb, which was never found, and his empire fragmented among his generals, ushering in a new era. When Alexander died without a clear heir, his generals tore the empire apart in decades of brutal warfare. One of these generals, Ptolemy, son of Lagos, seized control of Egypt. He was a brilliant military leader and a shrewd politician. He hijacked Alexander's funeral procession, bringing the body back to Egypt to legitimize his rule. During the Wars of the Diadochi, Ptolemy successfully defended Egypt against multiple invasions. In 305 BCE, he officially declared himself king, founding the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Ptolemies were Macedonian Greeks. They spoke Greek, governed with a Greek bureaucracy, and promoted Hellenistic culture. But they also understood that to rule Egypt, they had to honor its traditions. They proclaimed themselves pharaohs, built temples to Egyptian gods, and depicted themselves in reliefs wearing pharaonic crowns. It was a monarchy with two faces, Greek for the ruling elite in Alexandria, and Egyptian for the native people in the countryside. Under Ptolemy I and his son Ptolemy II Philadelphus, Alexandria became the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean world. Ptolemy I founded the Museion, Temple of the Muses, a research institute where scholars were paid to study. Attached to the Museion was the Great Library of Alexandria, which sought to collect all human knowledge. Ptolemaic agents bought, copied, or confiscated manuscripts from all over the known world. At its height, the library contained between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls. Scholars like Euclid revolutionized mathematics. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with astonishing accuracy. Herophilus performed human dissections, laying the foundations of anatomy. Aristarchus proposed that the Earth orbits the Sun 18 centuries before Copernicus. It was an unparalleled intellectual flowering, financed by Egypt's agricultural wealth. The Ptolemies adopted a pharaonic practice that scandalized the Greeks, sibling marriage. Ptolemy II married his full sister, Arsinoe II. This was both political and symbolic. Politically, it consolidated power within the royal family, preventing competing factions. Symbolically, it imitated the Egyptian gods Osiris and Isis, who were brother-spouse. The Ptolemies were deified as living gods. State cults were established where priests performed rituals for the pharaoh and his wife as deities. Arsinoe II was particularly powerful, effectively co-ruling with her brother. After her death, she was deified with temples dedicated exclusively to her. Successive Ptolemies continued this practice. Brother married sister, generation after generation. The inevitable result was increasing inbreeding, genetic weakness, and mental instability in some later generations. But during the first 100 years of Ptolemaic rule, Egypt prospered. It controls Cyprus, cities on the coast of Asia Minor, and territories in Syria-Palestine. It is a respected Mediterranean power, feared by Hellenistic rivals. But from the middle of the 2nd century BCE, everything begins to unravel. The Ptolemies face native rebellions in Upper Egypt. Native Egyptians, weary of crushing taxes, Greek rule, and cultural marginalization, rise up. Local native kings rule Thebes for 2 decades before finally being suppressed. Externally, the Ptolemaic kingdom loses territory to the rival Seleucid Empire, then to the rising Rome. Dynastic civil war becomes endemic. Ptolemies fight against Ptolemies, brother against brother, mother against son. Ptolemy Octavian Euergetes II massacres his brother's family, expels intellectuals from Alexandria, and rules by terror. Intellectual brilliance gives way to political brutality. And always, on the western horizon, the shadow of Rome looms. By the end of the 2nd century BCE, Rome dominated the Mediterranean. It had destroyed Carthage, conquered Greece, and subjugated Macedonia. The Ptolemies understood that their survival depended on Roman tolerance. Ptolemy 12 elites, the flute player, paid massive bribes to Roman politicians to maintain his throne. When he was ousted by a rebellion in 58 BCE, he bribed the Roman governor of Syria to reinstate him militarily. Roman soldiers installed elites again, massacring opponents. Elites realized that Egypt was effectively a Roman protectorate. To secure the succession, he appointed his eldest children as co-rulers, his 18-year-old daughter, Cleopatra 7, and his 10-year-old son, Ptolemy 13. Following Ptolemaic custom, they married. Then elites died in 51 BCE, leaving a fragile kingdom in the hands of rival teenagers. Cleopatra 7 is not the one-dimensional seductress of popular legend. She is a polyglot intellectual who speaks Egyptian, Greek, Latin, Aramaic, Hebrew, and possibly other languages. She is the first of her dynasty in centuries to bother learning Egyptian, connecting with her native subjects. She reads philosophy, mathematics, and medicine. But she is also a ruthless politician, navigating a world dominated by men and Roman military might. Initially, she rules with her brother husband, the young Ptolemy 13, but the boy's advisors oust her from power in 49 BCE. Cleopatra flees to Syria and raises an army. As she plots to reconquer Egypt, world history pivots. Julius Caesar pursues his rival Pompey into Egypt. Pompey seeks refuge, but Ptolemy XIII's advisors assassinate him, presenting his head to Caesar as a gift. Caesar is horrified, not flattered. The assassination of a Roman consul dishonors Rome. Cleopatra sees her opportunity. According to legend, she sneaks into the royal palace of Alexandria, wrapped in a rug or sack of linen, to meet with Caesar undetected by Ptolemy's forces. Whether this story is true or not, Cleopatra impresses Caesar. At 52, Caesar is captivated by the intelligent, politically astute, and charming 21-year-old queen. Caesar sides with Cleopatra. Civil war erupts in Alexandria. Ptolemy XIII's forces besiege Caesar and Cleopatra in the palace district. For months, they fight in the streets. The Great Library is possibly damaged as battle fires spread. Finally, Roman reinforcements arrive. Ptolemy XIII dies, drowned in the Nile while fleeing. Caesar installs Cleopatra as queen, nominally marrying her to his younger brother, the 11-year-old Ptolemy XIV. But everyone knows who really rules. Cleopatra gives birth to a son, Caesarion, Little Caesar, claiming that Caesar is the father. Caesar never officially acknowledges him, but neither does he deny it. Caesar returns to Rome, but is assassinated in March of 44 BCE. His will names his great-nephew Octavian as heir, ignoring Caesarion. The Roman world disintegrates in civil war. Octavian and Mark Antony against Caesar's assassins, then Octavian against Antony. Mark Antony, controlling the eastern provinces, summons Cleopatra to Tarsus in 41 BCE. She arrives on a golden barge, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, with silver oars and purple sails. It is masterful political theater. Antony is captivated. Unlike Caesar, Antony gives himself completely. He falls in love with Cleopatra. They winter in Alexandria in decadent luxury. Cleopatra gives birth to twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. The alliance is as much political as romantic. Cleopatra needs Roman protection to maintain her throne. Antony needs Egyptian wealth to finance his imperial ambitions. Antony and Cleopatra devised a bold plan to create a new Eastern Empire independent of Rome, merging Roman power and Egyptian wealth. In 34 BCE, Antony staged a ceremony in Alexandria called the Donations of Alexandria. He declared Caesarion ruler of Egypt with Cleopatra, presenting him as the legitimate son of Julius Caesar, heir to the Caesarian name. He assigned territories to his own children with Cleopatra. Alexander Helios would receive Armenia and eastern Parthia. Cleopatra Selene would receive Cyrenaica and Libya, and his youngest son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, would receive Syria and Asia Minor. It was a radical reorganization of the Eastern Mediterranean, and it was a declaration of war against Octavian. In Rome, Octavian used propaganda brilliantly, portraying Antony as a treacherous Roman bewitched by a seductive foreign queen who abandoned Rome for decadent Eastern pleasures. The narrative was sexist and xenophobic, but politically effective. 32 years BCE. Octavian declares war, not formally against Antony, but against Cleopatra, portraying her as a foreign threat. Antony and Cleopatra assemble a massive fleet and army. The fleet concentrates on the western coast of Greece, in the Gulf of Actium. Octavian and his brilliant admiral Agrippa blockade the fleet. For months, Antony and Cleopatra's forces remain trapped. Disease spreads. Supplies dwindle. Allies desert. Finally, on September 2nd, 31 BCE, they decide to break the blockade. The Battle of Actium is chaotic and decisive. Midway through the battle, Cleopatra orders her 60 Egyptian ships to set sail and retreat, possibly according to a prearranged plan to conserve resources, possibly in a panic. Antony follows suit, abandoning his fleet. It is a military and public relations disaster. The remaining fleet collapses. The land army surrenders to Octavian. Antony and Cleopatra flee to Egypt, but they know it is the end. During the following year, they desperately tried to negotiate, prepare defenses, and contemplate joint suicide. Cleopatra possibly negotiated secretly with Octavian, offering to abdicate if her children were spared. But Octavian had no interest in compromise. He wanted Egypt intact and Cleopatra as a captive for his triumph in Rome. August of 30 BC. Octavian's Roman legions approach Alexandria from the east and west. Antony, with the remnants of his loyal army, attempts to defend the city. He leads a desperate cavalry charge that initially succeeds, but it is a hollow victory. His troops are demoralized and outnumbered. The next day, August 1st, as Antony prepares a final defense, his remaining fleet and cavalry desert to Octavian without a fight. The betrayal is complete. Antony returns to the palace, defeated. According to later accounts, someone mistakenly tells him that Cleopatra is dead. In despair, Antony stabs himself with his own sword. But the wound is not immediately fatal. Then a message arrives. Cleopatra is alive, taking refuge in her mausoleum. Antony is taken to the mausoleum where Cleopatra has locked herself away with 2 servants. Cleopatra refuses to open the doors, fearing capture. Instead, Antony is hoisted by ropes through a high window. He dies in Cleopatra's arms, who embraces him, covered in blood, lamenting the fate that has destroyed them. Later Roman historians, notably Plutarch, dramatize this scene as a romantic tragedy. The reality is probably more complex. 2 ambitious politicians whose alliance and personal relationship collapsed in the face of superior Roman power. Octavian enters Alexandria unopposed. The city, rich beyond imagination, amassing treasures for 3 centuries, is now his. But he wants one more element for his triumph: Cleopatra alive. Octavian sends emissaries to Cleopatra, assuring her of honorable treatment. Cleopatra is not naive. She knows he intends to parade her in chains in his triumphal procession through Rome, humiliated before the crowds. She has seen how the Romans treated Vercingetorix, the Gallic chieftain, displayed in Caesar's triumph, then strangled in prison. She saw her sister, Arsinoe, forced to walk in chains in Caesar's triumph decades earlier. She will not suffer such humiliation. Cleopatra negotiates carefully, seeking guarantees for her children. Caesarion has been sent south to Upper Egypt, possibly attempting to reach Nubia or India with treasure to restart his life. Cleopatra's 3 youngest children with Antony are under Roman control. August 12, 30 BCE. Cleopatra elaborately dresses, donning royal robes. She requests a final meal. She is allowed privacy with her 2 most loyal handmaids, Iras and Charmian. Then Cleopatra dies. Exactly how is a historical mystery. Popular legend says that a venomous snake, an asp, is introduced into a basket of figs. The snake bites her, causing a relatively quick but dramatic death. Roman writers loved this story, the exotic Eastern queen dying by the sacred Egyptian serpent, a symbol of pharaonic royalty. But modern researchers are skeptical. Asp bites are painful, slow, and visibly disfiguring. Alternatively, Cleopatra, knowledgeable in medicine and poisons, could have taken a self-prepared lethal mixture: hemlock, aconite, opium. A quick, relatively painless death. Her servants die with her, probably by suicide as well, ensuring that the secret of the method dies with them. When the Roman guards enter, they find Cleopatra dead in her bed, dressed in royal robes, seemingly asleep. Charmian, in his death throes, is still adjusting his queen's crown. Octavian is furious. His main trophy for triumph has slipped through his fingers. But he is also pragmatic. He orders that Cleopatra be buried with royal honors next to Antony, respecting her last wishes. Caesar Ion, captured while trying to flee to the Red Sea, is quietly executed. Octavian cannot allow Caesar's supposed son to live as a potential rival. Cleopatra's 3 youngest children with Antony are taken to Rome, raised by Octavia, Octavian's sister and Antony's former wife. They survive. Cleopatra Selene eventually marries King Juba II of Mauritania, becoming queen. The Ptolemaic line continues weakly through her, but Ptolemaic Egypt is over. Octavian annexed Egypt directly as his personal possession. It was not a normal senatorial province governed by Roman aristocrats. It was the emperor's property, administered by an equestrian prefect. No Roman senator could enter without imperial permission. Octavian understood that whoever controlled Egypt controlled Rome's grain supply. A third of the grain that fed Rome came from Egypt. It was too strategic to risk. Octavian, who would soon take the title Augustus, presented himself in Egyptian propaganda as a pharaoh, perpetuating the fiction. Temples were built in his honor with traditional pharaonic iconography. But everyone knew that Egypt was now subordinate, part of a larger imperial machine. The Ptolemaic bureaucracy continued to function, but it served Roman masters. Taxes flowed to Rome. Roman legions were permanently stationed in Alexandria and other strategic locations. For the next 3 centuries, under Roman and then Byzantine rule, ancient Egyptian civilization slowly faded. Christianity spread, beginning in the 1st century CE. By the 4th century, it was the dominant religion. Ancient temples were closed by imperial edicts. The priests who had maintained rituals for 3,000 years were dispersed. The hieroglyphs, no longer taught, became incomprehensible. The last dated hieroglyphic inscription is carved in the Temple of Isis at Philae in 394 CE. A priest named Esmet wrote a dedication to the god Mangulus. He probably didn't know he was closing a 3,500-year chapter. After him, silence. The hieroglyphs became decorative curiosities, their meaning lost for 1,400 years until Champollion deciphered them in 1822. So why did a civilization that lasted 3 millennia fall? There is no simple answer. Part of it is geographical. Egypt, isolated for millennia by deserts and seas, was eventually overtaken by larger empires with superior resources. Part of it is technological. Egypt did not develop ironworking as effectively as rivals, limiting its military capabilities. Part of it is structural. Reliance on the central pharaonic authority meant that when the center weakened, the entire system fragmented. Part of it is economic. The redistributive economy, based on agricultural surpluses from the Nile, functioned in isolation, but could not compete with the more dynamic, monetary, trade economies of the Hellenistic Mediterranean. Part of it is simply luck. Prolonged periods of drought destabilized kingdoms at critical moments. But although political Egypt died, its cultural legacy is immortal. The Greeks learned geometry and medicine from Egypt. The Romans imported obelisks, placing them in their cities as symbols of power. Egyptian mystery religions, especially the cult of Isis, spread throughout the Roman Empire, influencing the development of Christianity. Monumental Egyptian architecture inspired neoclassical styles in Europe and America centuries later. The elaborate concept of life after death, the moral judgment of the soul, and resurrection influenced Mediterranean theologies. Modern fascination with ancient Egypt, Egyptomania, rises periodically after the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, after each new archaeological excavation. The pyramids remain among the most recognizable structures on the planet. The Nile still flows, and along its banks, 3,000-year-old temples still stand, testaments to a civilization that measured eternity not in centuries, but in millennia. And there are still unsolved mysteries. The tombs of Cleopatra and Mark Antony have never been found, likely submerged by earthquakes that sank parts of ancient Alexandria beneath the Mediterranean Sea. The tomb of Alexander the Great, visited by Roman emperors for centuries, vanished during late antiquity, its location lost. Vast archives of papyri in Alexandria were burned, destroyed, or lost, erasing knowledge we will never recover. Beneath the sands of Egypt, archaeologists still uncover tombs, temples, and entire forgotten cities. Each excavation reveals more about this extraordinary people who built for eternity. 3,000 years after the last great pharaoh, 5,000 years after the first dynasties, ancient Egypt still speaks to us. In stone and gold, in fragile papyrus and faded paint, in hieroglyphs finally deciphered after centuries of silence. The story of ancient Egypt is not just a story of kings and conquests. It is the story of humanity's ambition to transcend mortality, to build something that will last when everything else fades to dust. And in that, the ancient Egyptians succeeded. For as long as we speak of Ramses, as long as we gaze at the pyramids in awe, as long as museums display gilded sarcophagi and preserved mummies, ancient Egypt lives on. The pharaohs achieved their dream of eternity, not through magic, but through monuments, words, and memory. Ancient Egypt has died, but it will never be forgotten.